Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today, and welcome to another seminar in our Faith Formation series. I'm Nisha Jacob. I'm a member here at St. Michael's, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. So I hope you've all had a chance to enjoy the sunshine today, because I believe it's going away again. I welcome to warm your hearts in today's session. Today's topic is a rather challenging one, the difficult topic of finding God in suffering. And we're very honored to have two esteemed speakers who I will introduce shortly. Our second speaker has just arrived, who unfortunately got a little bit lost, but we're very grateful that he's just made it. And he'll be welcome, Tony. We're glad you made it safely. So I will introduce our speakers just before they talk. The format will be very similar to the previous seminars that many of you may have attended. So we'll have two speakers today. They will each speak for approximately 20 minutes. And after both have spoken, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. And please feel free to share and to have some robust engagement after the talks. And we hope to end the evening just after 8 p.m. And you're welcome to hang around a little bit afterwards if you'd like to have more one-on-one chats with each other, with our speakers, and build community. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker, whom I've had the privilege of working with in one of my other roles. So Christelle Cornelius is an occupational therapist by training and currently the CEO at St. Joseph's Intermediate Pediatric Care. She's also wife to Neville Africa, a mother of two beautiful daughters aged 13 and 20, and actively involved in the children's ministry of her home church, St. James in Kenilworth. And Christelle's talk is entitled Fully Known and Fully Loved. Thank you very much, Christelle.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you for having me here tonight. It's a great privilege and an honor. I was saying to Nisha earlier that when you speak about these things to your own tribe, it's quite easy. So please forgive me if I stutter a little, and what an honor to share the space with Prof. Westwood. So thank you. The topic of faith and suffering. I've thought about this much, and today I'd like to share some of my personal and my professional story of how I got to be in a place of love and healing in 2024. I have shared with you a little card. It has the text of Psalm 139 on it. This is my favorite scripture. I'm not quite sure when I learned about it, or I have to say it's been a constant in my head and heart. And I invite you to remember it as I share, and then I've given you the card for you to take home with you and think about. The big idea about Psalm 139 is fully known and fully loved from before time began. It suggests that God always knows and He's always in it. And I think this is very good news to those who love God, because no matter what we do or where we go, we can never be far from His guidance and comfort. And so this is how great God is. So I was the third child and second daughter to my late parents, Ron and V. Cornelius. My parents were the children of farm workers, and my dad became a very successful businessman with, I believe, the most beautiful wife in our small town. My sister died at a very young age of illness, and this caused my parents to struggle with depression. So I spent many of my early years with my grandparents. My granddad built a small wooden iron church on the land given to the small Indian community in compensation on the north coast of KwaZulu-Natal. And so many of my days were spent in cottage meetings and prayer meetings, Sunday school and church, and my cousins and I had the great task of cleaning the pews and setting the hymn books before church. My parents and extended family were not only church-going Christians, but they were always involved in supporting and serving others, and so this became very familiar to me. My gran very faithfully taught me Bible verses and songs, and so my faith journey started of being fully known and fully loved. And I guess this is probably where I learned some of the psalm as well. When I was about 7, my dad lost his business, and this resulted in us losing our home. which was a very difficult time for my brothers and I who didn't understand these changes. And my dad also left for a while, and so my mom and my grandparents had to care for us. And my mom was a very strong woman, very loving and stern, had great discernment, but her love was always shown in the way she cared for all our needs. She was amazing. She taught me to cook and clean and shop and manage a household, and very involved in church life. And both my parents and my siblings were very musical. And so one of our favorite activities as a family was sing-alongs with lots of instruments and amps and loudspeakers. And I remember that my parents' front door was seldom locked, and there was always someone stopping for a meal. They were hosting many people, caring for families in distress. They even looked after a baby till she was 2 years old, and my cousin until they passed away. So I grew up with 4 brothers. I never had to change a tire or fill petrol or wash a car. These are the benefits. When we were 13, when I was 13, we moved to Cape Town, which again was a bit difficult because I was very attached to my grandparents, and our family was our community. But we joined a local church, and this again showed me that God's amazing love was in giving us a new family and support structure. And when I was 18, I guess teenage years ending, I decided I wanted to find my own church community. And like God always does, He had a plan. And I ended up joining St. James Church in Kenilworth. At first, I did not remember that it was the church that experienced the massacre. But I found that forgiveness and reconciliation and love were taught so faithfully. And I started to grow in my understanding of faith and grace, no longer under the wings of my parents. And now I can see how God was purposefully directing me to grow so that when the storms would come and the seasons would change, I too would keep trusting. I was fortunate to study occupational therapy and was a recipient of a bursary, which resulted in me finding my first work opportunity at Critics Care Hospital. I ached, though, to be involved in community development. And so after 5 years, I found my first NGO opportunity. I met my husband in 1998, and we married in 2001. And so life was carrying on. My dad was thriving in his business. My mom worked in a little shop, and we all grew up. And my brothers had children, and life was feeling good. On the 28th of October in 2003, my parents were involved in a car accident. My dad was the driver of the car. A bus stopped without warning, and my dad crashed into the rear end. And my mom sustained severe injuries, and it resulted in her death. For 2 weeks, while she was in hospital, we prayed and pleaded and yearned for healing. And I remember a verse that I'd learned. The Lord gives, the Lord takes, blessed be the name of the Lord. And on the 10th of November at 8 o'clock, my mom died. My dad very bravely took my hand and led me to my mom's bedside and reminded me not to be sad that she was no longer here, but to be grateful for the years that God gave her to us. I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, and I really wanted my mom. And I struggled to understand God's plan. I struggled with this, and I fought hard to forget God and to try to cope on my own. But my coping methods were not very good. They were harmful and not helpful. Eventually, I joined a grief support group. I went for counseling, and I started to heal. My marriage really struggled, but with support from our growth group and counseling, we healed too. My dad spent most of his time with us. My husband, my daughter, and I, and my daughter was named after my sister and my mom, so naturally she became the apple of his eye. And my brother's children didn't live close by, and so they just doted on each other. And a friend once asked me, how would I survive if anything happened to my dad? And I so hastily answered, oh, God wouldn't allow tragedy to happen again. He was a treasure, this dad of mine. He was the dad who wrote notes, who called to say good morning and good night, and popped in for tea and took me on dates. But on the 14th of November, 2007, my dad was shot and killed in what we think was an attempted hijacking. We believe he died instantly, and there was no warning, no preparation for a trauma that was almost 4 years to the date of my mom's accident. This great guy who loved people and gave his energy and time and support to communities died so tragically. It was heartbreaking, and we again had to learn to pick up these pieces and carry on. But the words that I remember was, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes, blessed be the name of the Lord." I remember in those early days of sadness, I felt very grateful for a husband who allowed me to love my dad so wholeheartedly and allowed me to give him attention for these 4 years I had with him alone, without my mom. He entertained the nature walks and the road trips, and so I'm grateful that fully known and fully loved was also that God had now blessed me with a partner who could share my grief and stay with me in the tough times. After 7 months, I moved into my dad's house. I really didn't want to go home. I wanted to live with my siblings. It was difficult, but after 7 months, I went back home, and I believe God started to restore us. We had a second child. We were excelling in our work and our marriage, and life was feeling better. I worked in communities at this time for about 17 years and had grown professionally. By 30, I had achieved my first management role, and by 35, I had gotten a program director role in a medium NGO. I no longer practiced as a clinical occupational therapist, but was on a leadership journey. I'd learning about governance and capacity building, and from possibility to practice became this background of my career. I was feeling really fulfilled and really enjoying whatever was coming my way. It felt really good. In 2016, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And then I said, seriously, God, what else? But God remained really faithful. He had treatment and recovered and has been cancer-free for 5 years. In 2017, we were both retrenched. And here we found ourselves without employment or the support that we longed for. And this thing about staying trusting was the constant. My husband started a business, and God's grace grew him, and he's thriving. And I found new opportunities. And in 2020, St. Joseph's found me. And so part of my story today is to tell you a little bit about this place that I found myself. In 2020, pre-pandemic, what a time to be in leadership at a health facility. God is God. That's one thing I keep reminding myself. Many NGOs closed during this time, and here I was in a loving, safe environment where you can openly pray and seek God's guidance. And for the past 4.5 years, I've had the opportunity to help children with life-limiting and life-changing illnesses with their families and help them recover and thrive or die with dignity. I have put up some of the stats of the number of children we see, the age groups, and how sort of the demographics of St. Joseph's. St. Joseph's is a really incredible place. It's a place of love and healing, a place I find myself in 2024. It was started by a group of religious sisters in 1935, and they have supported the care and restoration of more than 25,000 children over 90 years. Many children come from dire circumstances where poverty and social exclusion is their understanding of life. At St. Joseph's, we have an opportunity to support children and their families. Many children don't have the stories I have of loving parents, warmth, shelter, security. Parents have little agency and children grow up with minimal access. But in St. Joseph's, the sisters have taught us to give children their best opportunity to thrive, not just survive. And I believe my life journey has helped me develop empathy to lead a team that walks the path with children and their families. I would like to show you a short video to tell you more about what happens at St. Joseph's. Whenever I think of St. Joseph's, I think of the opportunity to remember fully known and fully loved children are restored, sometimes they die, but with dignity and love. And it reminds me that even though there's suffering, there is also hope. Recently, we lost a young child with cerebral palsy. He died very peacefully sitting in his buggy, watching the outside world. The team, realizing what had happened, had called the doctor, who then had confirmed that he had passed away. When I arrived at her office, she very graciously reminded me that he was in a place with no cerebral palsy. He was fully able and whole again. And this is the hope that inspires. On this side of heaven, there is suffering and sorrow. But faith reminds us that there's also hope and restoration. And so here I find myself in 2024, blessed to be part of a strong, loving family, an amazing community, and an ability to serve and work in an amazing service where humility, love, and compassion are a daily practice. And this is a blessing. I think I had a fair share of challenges, and still I've come to find, time and time again, not because of who I am, but because of who God is. I believe He is faithful to all His promises. Fully known and fully loved is a story of my life. I was not saved from suffering, but God has stayed with me and carried me. And my children like to use the word FROG, which stands for fully reliant on God. And I'm thankful and I believe that God is good, He's gracious, and He's always in control. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you very much, Christelle. That was really a beautiful story, and thank you for sharing that story with us and for allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of so many people whom you don't know. I know you were very anxious, and we're really grateful that you were able to share those experiences, both personal and professional, and we look forward to chatting a little bit more with you around that. But I'd like to now introduce our second speaker. It's my great honor to welcome Professor Tony Westwood, who has worked as a pediatrician for most of his professional life. And providing care to children with long-term conditions and their families has been his main inspiration. But on a personal level, I've also had the privilege of being taught by Tony during my undergraduate medical studies. And I can confirm that Tony's creative and compassionate teaching approach and his approach with patients has certainly inspired me and many others. Tony's talk today is entitled, "Who is My Doctor? Getting to the Heart of Things." Over to you, Tony.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope I'm audible. I've got my breath back after getting lost in the mean streets of Rondebosch. Thank you very much for the invitation. I must say, when it first came, I thought, no, not that subject. Why would anybody agree to talk on the subject of suffering and faith? I saw a senior cleric sigh and flinch when this title was mentioned. Suffering, whether human or not, takes us to the heart of matters spiritual, existential, philosophical, theological. It is universal, by which I mean it is everywhere, as well as seemingly built into the universe as we see it and experience it. Faith, at least my faith, looks at universal suffering and, with the senior cleric, flinches. But faith, and perhaps my faith, continues to look, even steps forward into the suffering. Faith, at least my faith, is not content with the theological statement, there was no suffering in the Garden of Eden. In other words, it's all due to Adam's fall, or it's Adam's fault. In other words, it's all to do with humans. Such statements could allow one to wash one's hands of it, have it all explained off pat, cast one of Douglas Adams' favourite someone else's problem fields over suffering, or say it'll all come right in the end and walk, nay, run away. Faith, at least my faith, acknowledges that there is much about suffering that is unexplained, resolutely inexplicable in this life, deeply and troublingly mysterious. Yet faith, at least my faith, soldiers on through the muck and the murk. Sometimes faith, at least my faith, falls flat on its face in the mud. At other times, a shard of light penetrates the pain and moves one on. Faith cannot look away. Perhaps faith dare not look away, for to do so would be for it to lose something essential. So I don't know why I agreed to talk today. Perhaps it was the opportunity to move forward in my own faith journey, a chance to codify and express things that have challenged and troubled, and do challenge and trouble, and I imagine will challenge and trouble me on that journey. I'm sincerely hoping that the talk will be more than a self-centered synthesis of personal thoughts and experience on this demanding subject, that what I will say will shed a little of that light that I spoke about for some, if not all of us. My focus will be on other people's suffering and my faith, and perhaps our faith. So not faith through personal suffering, but faith despite pervasive suffering in the world, and faith that produces a response to that suffering. It might be helpful for me to define faith and suffering before I move on, what they mean and how they look to me. The writer to the Hebrews equates faith with assurance of hope and certainty in what we cannot see. Not faith 101, but faith 111, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. So I profess faith in God's sovereignty, his holiness, his loving kindness, all of them pretty invisible. I believe in the redemptive power of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Without that, I have no hope. I have faith that God's kingdom is alive and active on earth, and if I knew what it meant, in the universe. And suffering? Well, I'll let the psalmist describe it, Psalm 102. I am stricken, withered like grass. I cannot find the strength to eat. Wasted away, I groan along, and my skin hangs on my bones. I'm like a desert owl in the wilderness, an owl that lives among the ruins. Thin and meager, I wail in solitude, like a bird that flutters on the rooftop. And from Job's experience, Job chapter 30, terror upon terror overwhelms me. It sweeps away my resolution like the wind, and my hope of victory vanishes like a cloud. So now my soul is in turmoil within me, and misery has me daily in its grip. By night pain pierces my very bones, and there is ceaseless throbbing in my veins, and of course in countless poems and pictures. The discipline of palliative medicine helpfully describes suffering as having a number of dimensions: physical, emotional, spiritual, and social. They're often combined in or for the individual sufferer. Associated words can help us to picture it: pain, distress, trouble, grief, and so on. Importantly, suffering is subjective. It is felt. Of course, it can be simulated, but that is not the subject here, except that it reminds us that there are recognizable signs of suffering if only we can look. Even suffering in silence has its signs. And now, to faith and the suffering of others. Jesus wept. Jesus was moved to his very bowels. In warm compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the leper. Looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed and said to the deaf man, "Be opened." Jesus said, "I feel sorry for these people." Jesus looked straight at him, and his heart warmed to him. The sight of the people, harassed and helpless, moved him to pity. Well, faith says, if Jesus, then me. Gut responses, positive ones that is, and empathy are signs of the kingdom of God at work in me. They are signposts for discipleship. I'm going to describe some of what I'll call in shorthand my Jesus moments. Most but not all relate to my career in child health. These are examples of what I term faith that produces a response earlier. I'm going to preface that with a personal experience related to more difficult faith despite pervasive suffering in the world, because that is germane to this evening's purpose and has links to the main stories that follow. 1994 was, on balance, a very happy year for South Africa, an amazing election, a dawn of democracy with a hope of fairness and restitution, a wonderful new president, a miracle year for South Africa. I was 38 years old, a junior pediatrician with a wife and 4 small children. A committed Christian, working at Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital and the University of Cape Town, strongly linked with the church, especially through music. But 1994 also encompassed the Rwandan genocide with a level of horror and suffering unparalleled in my experience. Simultaneously, terrible human nastiness and cruelties were being perpetrated in the Balkans. These two cauldrons of suffering brought to life historical terrors and calamities that, terrible as they were, had been at arm's length when I read about them, things like the Holocaust and the crimes of the conquistadores in America. Now they were unavoidably near and real, and my faith did not seem to be up to this onslaught. And then Comet Shoemaker Livy 9 smashed into Jupiter. The apparent randomness of this event, together with the depths of suffering and cruelty in the world, present and past, knocked my faith out of orbit. It wobbled nauseously around the universe for a full 3 years before gradually finding its gravitational center in an adjusted orbit, better attuned to the depths of sorrow and more resilient and certainly grateful. Isaiah's bruised reed and a smoldering flame come to mind. Now, to those Jesus moments when faith, even bruised faith, responded to suffering. I have to acknowledge with remorse that many Jesus moments, thousands of them, that have been quashed, squashed, or extinguished along the way. So these examples that I share represent something exceptional and precious. To quote the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Philippians, "For it is God who works in you, inspiring both the will and the deed for his own chosen purpose." Faith believes that. Jesus moments 1 to 3 led in the same direction. In 1988, I was a Callow Paediatric trainee in the Paediatric ICU, my most unfavorite place in the health services. I was looking after a 4-month-old baby named Margaret from the Northern Cape. She was on a ventilator with a tube passing through her vocal cords, supporting her damaged lungs. So she had no voice, and her family could not be there. One day I looked into her eyes and was, as it were, drawn in. Who was this person? How was what was happening to her affecting her? What did she think? What did her future look like? Well, it was a life and career-changing moment, a personal encounter with and revelation of what is now called the life course approach. 2 years later, I was a more senior trainee gaining experience in pediatric neurology, that's brain and nerve conditions in childhood. I wanted to study and gain experience in community pediatrics, but stepped back to let someone else more deserving, in my view, have that job. Neurology is a tough call with its attendant D words: disability, degeneration, deterioration, and discrimination, and death. For me, it was a fulfilling time of learning and giving, but only towards the end of that 2-year stint did I have my own D for Damascus Road Jesus moment. She was a girl named Bronwyn, for whom I didn't seem to be able to do more. She was not dying or deterioration, but we could not control her epilepsy with major consequences for her quality of life and education. This time it was her parents' eyes that caught me, their D for desperation. I knew then that for every child with an incurable condition, especially the more severe ones, good care for the parents is intrinsic to the good care to the child. You'd think that was obvious, but had not been taught this in many years of pediatrics, and it wasn't clearly modeled as far as I could see to the depth that was required to help parents be the parents they need in the face of the suffering of their child. And this was reinforced by Jesus Moment 3, which occurred the following year when I finally was in the community pediatrics job. I met a father in the corridor. His son had a complex congenital syndrome. It was not my patient. Indeed, I'd never seen either of them before. Pressing his son's appointment card on me, he asked in distress, "Doctor, who is my doctor?" He meant his son's doctor. There were appointments for 5 clinics on that card. There and then, in my spirit, I determined to stretch out my arm over health services for children and their parents and change the way we do things, what we prioritize in the delivery of the care to children with incurable conditions. No more should parents like this father be harassed and helpless. In the following year, 1992, I was offered my first consultant pediatric job at Red Cross Hospital and began cutting my experiential teeth on children and families with a life-limiting condition called cystic fibrosis. I spent more than 20 years in that, for me, very formative clinic. Jesus Moment 4 came in that first year when I sat helpless while a teenage patient and his mother lobbed verbal grenades at one another over my bemused head in my consultation room. I added the care of adolescents to my list of things that had to change for me and for the many others like me. In pursuit of what I saw as my calling in the face of the significant suffering of parents and inadequately practitioners like myself, equating my suffering to my colleagues who often would be facing similar senses of not being able to know what to do, I asked for what was a countercultural transfer from the more swanky, highly specialized upper floors of the Red Cross Hospital to the sweaty and often overwhelmed ground floor. The ground floor housed the outpatient department, where patients, such as I was concerned about, received care from dozens of staff and staff teams in multiple specialized clinic. It also housed the emergency areas, of which more in a moment. To cut a decades-long story short, from when I landed there to the present, my mission to improve our delivery of care to children with long-term conditions and their families has not changed. The latest step after my formal retirement nearly 6 years ago has been the development of short online courses that teach what is important in the care of children with incurable conditions and their families, and how to approach the care of adolescents and their parents to people who can't get to Cape Town and are living and working a long way from where they would get this kind of training. I will further explain the place of faith in this journey later, but we'll move on to another illustrative story at this point. While on the journey I've been describing, Jesus Moment 5 took me on a new and parallel faith journey in my work. As I said, I was now working in the emergency areas of Red Cross that came with the outpatient oversight that I had craved. Every year in Cape Town, in the latter months of summer, services have to deal with thousands of babies and small children who develop gastroenteritis, in which diarrhea is the main symptom and dehydration the main danger. In the era before proper referral systems and the building and commissioning of Mitchell's Plain and Khayelitsha hospitals, the bulk of these children arrived at the door of Red Cross Hospital outpatients and emergency department, which was my territory, in 1990s and the early 2000s. That is a mark of the community's faith in that hospital. Every year the pressures were immense, and as the post-1994 apartheid strictures on internal migration were lifted, these pressures increased. My job involved seeing Red Cross Hospital's response to the diarrhea deluge. Once more, it was someone's eyes that set off a Jesus moment and that set me on a new path. It was the desperation, the do something in the eyes of one of the middle grade doctors, expressing the feelings of both herself and her colleagues. I do apologize. It must be another Jesus moment. I don't think it is, though. It was the desperation, the do something in the eyes of one of the middle grade doctors, expressing the feelings of both herself and her colleagues as the swelling flow of children went on and on. That journey that started with a letter that I wrote on my colleague's behalf to the head of the Department of Health of the Western Cape led to a system-wide reorganization and annual refinement of how the department collaboratively handled this annual surge that I was able to play a significant role over a number of years as my job moved from hospital-based pediatrics to largely system-based child health. The same system was then applied to the winter viral pneumonia season among children in the province. So there are two faith and other people's suffering stories briefly told. There is a third and recent faith story that has been stimulated through engaging with the pervasive future suffering of the current generation of young children who will, along with their own children, unless we act now, be living in a catastrophe of untrammeled climate change later this century and beyond. But let me try to trace the place of personal faith in these stories. Jesus moments, I call these pivotal and generative experiences. They could simply have been human experiences. But faith links them to the kingdom of God, to Jesus' ministry of release and relief, to the healing and comforting heart of God. It sees the hand of God molding my weak clay in unexpected ways, and I'm certain preparing me for those moments. Faith was a spur, a motivation to engage meaningfully in people's suffering and to keep going by retaining that sense of inspiration that had launched these journeys. Faith has also been a shield against the inevitable disappointments and frustrations, both external and internal, along the way. Faith was the basis for resilience and perseverance. Even when it was at its weakest, faith clung to the need for promoting good in the world, which in its stronger Hebrews 1:1:1 moments saw the invisible kingdom of God in our work. It had never struck me till I prepared this talk that faith, one of the Apostle Paul's trio of things that last forever, is, in the face of suffering, like its greater sister love that he poetically described in the famous chapter 13 of his first letter to the Corinthian church. Faith is patient. It engenders kindness. There is nothing it cannot face. There is no limit to its hope and endurance. Just before I end, I want to give a nod to aspects of suffering that I have not covered, perhaps we haven't covered together, but I would see as on the agenda under the rubric of faith and suffering. People suffering, so here are just a few, people suffering that they don't recognize as suffering because it feels normal to them. Suffering that arises from unfulfillable dreams or expectations of life, such as the chimeral American dream or the South African equivalent. I almost want to put this form of suffering into inverted commas. The suffering of living organisms at the hands of humans and other organisms. Suffering caused by churches and Christians. Suffering for one's faith, which in South Africa we only glimpse, but is daily a reality for Christians in dozens of countries around the world. But here I will stop and hand the talking stick on, first to Nisha, but I hope to others here for their stories of faith and suffering. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Tony. It was really amazing to see how Christelle's talk and your talk just flowed into each other and sharing those such a variety of different experiences on this really complex and challenging topic. And I know Tony was reluctant to speak initially, and I'm so grateful that you agreed and shared those wonderful insights and experiences. So thank you to both Christelle and Tony. And could I ask the two of you to take a seat up front while we open up for questions? And we're going to have a roving mic, so I'm going to bring the mic to you. But I'd like to open to the floor to ask any questions or share any comments based on what our two speakers have said. Please feel free. Just raise your hand and I'll come with the roving mic. But maybe as people are thinking, because I'm not seeing any hands jumping out, I just want to say, I think from both your talks, Christelle and Tony, it reminded me a bit of my own personal experience. So I'm a medical doctor with far less experience than both Christelle and Tony have in the healthcare sector. And I know that when I was in pediatrics, I found as a young, medical student and as a young doctor, that it was one of the most fulfilling, rewarding specialties in medicine, because you saw this joy in the children as they got better and you engaged with the families. But when I became a mother, I started to see my own child and the suffering of all of these patients, and I found that almost unbearable, wanting me to kind of be in a place to change this and run away from actually having to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And I didn't think, I was probably young and immature, and I didn't think of the role that faith would play in dealing with those complex emotions. So thank you both for, helping me as well to reflect on some of these aspects that it's such a difficult topic that we tend to kind of wrap it away or run away from it and try not to deal with it. And sometimes talking about it in this kind of setting helps us to reflect more on our personal experiences and how we can deal with it and how we have faith to help us to deal with these kind of experiences. So I'd like to welcome our audience. I know it's a tough topic to talk about, but do we have any questions or comments? Yes, we have someone at the back.
Well, I'm not going to ask my brother a question. So Estelle, I'd like to ask you something. So you gave us many examples through your life of when you had to bear enormous personal suffering through your family. And I was wondering how that prepared you in terms of the love you show now, where you are, where you're surrounded by families and people who are suffering, and how much your own experience of suffering helps you daily now. You may have told us that in your talk, but I'd like you just to say that again. Thank you.
Thank you. I did say that I do believe that God is gracious in the way He prepares you for the things that are going to come. And I think that one of the feelings I have often is a great sense of empathy towards what I see. And sometimes I have to be reminded that we can't fix all of the problems. But I think being compassionate, which is a value at St. Joseph's that we want to engender with our teams all the time, is that you can't solve all the problems, you can't fix all of the challenges, but having a heart of compassion. And I think Prof. Westwood has shared so much of scripture, and that was one of the things that I think God has graciously planted in my heart over many years. Having grown up in an environment where you sing songs and you learn about God's comfort and His grace, I get reminded constantly when you are confronted with these things, where do you go to? You can go home to your family, who can only give you so much, but you've got to be strong at home. And I find God's word very comforting. I find one of my favorite things to do in the morning is to listen to gospel radio, to listen to songs, to prepare for whatever's coming in the day. So I do think that my life experiences and the way God has allowed it to evolve has created an opportunity for me to go back to that place inside me where God renews my strength to deal with whatever's coming daily at St. Joseph's. Thank you.
Thank you, Christelle. Do we have any other comments or questions? Yes.
Thank you both for sharing both of your experiences. I have a question that I would like to ask both of you, if you wouldn't mind answering from both of your own experience. But have you ever found that seeing the suffering of others has shaken your own faith? How that can happen to others? And what your sort of, how you maintain your faith through that?
I think it is real that you become resentful sometimes and angry and feel bitter about things that happen. One of the things that I found very helpful is belonging in a community where others can point you back to how to come back to hope and faith. And I mentioned when I spoke about belonging to a community and having lost what I thought was my community, but God's faithfulness in bringing you back and finding people who share faith when you're struggling, because it doesn't stay. You don't say trusting every day. Some days you just feel like really, God, are you here? But I found communities like this very group, is what keeps you centered and points you back.
Thank you both. Do we have any other comments, questions? Yes, of course.
And this is something I didn't include in my talk, but I thought about, is that I have not used prayer and prayer groups in the health service enough to support what we do. And I think I missed a trick there, and the journey might have been a lot easier and more effective if I'd done that and not held it within myself. It's part of my personality. But I think it is something that those of us in health or other social services should strongly think about. Thank you.
What criteria do you use for when you employ carers? You talked about compassion. Difficult, huh?
I'm not sure if everyone heard that. Is what criteria do you use at St. Joseph's when you employ carers?
So it is very difficult because we have categories of staff and you're looking for professional skill, so you're looking for technical skill. And often we do assessments, but I believe there's a trick that I have learned in my few years at St. Joseph's, and I call it the walkabout. And often during those walkabouts with a new staff member, in that final interview, you get a sense of how they respond to children, how they respond to other staff members. And those behavioral attributes you don't easily just pick up in an interview. But we always also insist in the interview that this work that you're coming to do is not going to be easy. There's going to be grief. We often show the sanctuary as part of our walkabout, because that's where we keep a child who's just passed away. So families. So I think being real about it exposes. And of course, you'll find that you don't always make the best choice. And then it's to manage it in the best way possible. Thank you.
I saw a hand here.
Hi, everybody. I'm not too sure if this is a statement or a question. I'm a life coach, and having been through my own traumas in life, I remember I lost my husband 6.5 years ago to cancer. He was relatively young, he was in his 50s. And I remember a friend of mine calling and saying, "Why Joe?" Because he really was a spectacular human being. He was. And I don't know why I said it. I said, "Why not?" And not because I wasn't devastated. My child was 14, one was 19, but that's what came to me. Many years later, Odette and her husband had a Down syndrome child, and he really struggled to have this child. I mean, they had a 6-year-old who was, as we call, normal. What's normal? But anyway, by the world's standards. And then they had this amazing little girl, Juliana, who was Down syndrome. And she was struggling with her husband. She said, "Please just phone." And I phoned him and I said to him, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Actor, why me? Why us?" And I said, "Why not?" Because when he had asked me about why Joe, and as a life coach and more recently, there are young people that I work with, and it's young ladies, etc. And it's hard for me sometimes when they ask me really difficult questions, like somebody I love passed away, why them, why in the prime of their life? And I know this is so unfair to ask you, and I don't mean to ask you, but I'm going to anyway. So through your experience as a pediatric doctor and obviously in your NGO, do parents ask you that question? Why me? Why? It is our human condition, but I'm trying to sort of open that question. Why? We don't know, because it's faith, it's about trusting God, it's about Jeremiah 29:11, etc. But I'm going to ask you anyway, if I may be, why? What do you say when someone says, "Why me?" Thank you.
They're not easy questions.
So I think I've struggled with that question myself. And at St. Joseph's, one of the things I struggle with is going home to healthy children and children who have all their needs met. What has been very humbling is that parents very rarely ask that question. They often ask how they can do better for their children. And I think that has sort of really created an opportunity for us to be more compassionate when people do struggle. And because South Africa, the narrative is so difficult and there's so many other social ills, that sometimes the problems are bigger than the child's illness. And it's how to cope with the illness, how to go back home, how to manage a child when there's no electricity. And I think that one of the gifts we have in working in a health care facility like this is that you can partner with community, and Prof talked about this life course approach of trying to build a community for this child to go back into, where parents are not going to struggle so much. So my experience has been a little different, and maybe it's not been long enough, but it's been trying to support them, not necessarily with coping with their child's illness or disability, but coping with all the other challenges of living in an impoverished community.
Thank you for the question. It's not something I get asked often, maybe because I'm a doctor. I'm not a spiritual counselor, etc. What I do notice is that people of faith, when they're dealing with a child with an incurable condition, will go almost anywhere to try and get that child cured. And so that conversation is about the person's suffering and taking my view of life into their world and trying to walk that journey. So one of the young people with cystic fibrosis had terrible liver disease, and he was going to die of the liver disease. That family wanted to go to Nigeria because there was a healer in Nigeria, and I knew they were wasting their money. But I said, you're welcome back. I don't think it's going to help, but you're welcome as long as you don't make sure that you have no money at the end of it, etc., because they would need to go on that journey for when the child did die, to know that they'd done everything. But I wouldn't have asked them, if they wanted to spend millions to go to somewhere in San Francisco to get the latest medicine, as opposed to somebody putting their hands on them. So I think that one's own faith is also playing a part in that compassion question. What are they really asking? What are they really looking for? And how are we going to deal with the grief when it comes? And that's part of our training as professionals as well.
Thank you, Tony and Christelle. We have a question here.
For me, the whole thing of suffering turned on its face when being inspired by the incredible perseverance, joy, humor of the people who are suffering. They are amazing. Never complaining, never asking, always interested. And that, to me, is an inspiration to keep faith.
Thank you for sharing that, Jill. Do we have any other comments or questions? Yes.
Thank you both very much for the talk. My question is, what are the benefits of suffering, if I can say that? And then on the other side of the coin, what are the detriments of never experiencing it? And then possibly drawing on your own experiences, what did you gain, or what do you have now that you would not have had you not gone through the suffering? Thanks.
So I've chaired many panels, and this is definitely the hardest one. These questions are really soul-searching questions. But go for it, Tony.
I have to say, as a guest, thank you for the question. No, it's a very, very serious thing. And that's why I started with saying that it takes us to the heart of matters spiritual, existential, philosophical, and theological. And I'm an ordinary guy like you. So I'm going to answer your question as a peer-to-peer, as it were. And for me, the important thing here is that it's about just walking the journey. So I flipped the question. I was asked to talk. I think it's the possibility of talking in a similar way to Christelle. But I saw myself as having, as I said to my brother, a charmed life. That doesn't mean it's been suffering-free. I just explained one of my personal experiences, and there are many others. I was bullied at school. I can draw them out of my drawers and share them as needed. To answer it off, and I'm not avoiding the question, but the question is, we all suffer in different ways, and therefore to say that has purpose for an individual may actually be the last thing they need to hear at that particular point. So we have to keep that within ourselves and work it out for ourselves and find out when that conversation may happen. And it may happen, as you've heard from Christelle, many years later when the thing makes sense. And it may never make sense in this life. And then we have to support people through that. Could I just hold a mic for one more thing? And that was about social suffering and the question of a child being born with Down syndrome. Society produces suffering through discrimination and stigma. And we in churches have to make a big difference to that. And how many churches do you go into and find people with significant disabilities in the pews? Very few.
Thank you. So thank you. I echo what Prof has said, but I think the lady who spoke just before the question and said that there's so much of joy that one receives. And having worked in communities for so many years, and I know suffering is very relative. Each person experiences their life and their challenges as their personal suffering. And the things that I found very terrible for me personally was not comparative to some of the challenges I've heard in communities that I've worked in or with families I've worked in. So I don't think, like Prof said, that there is sort of a gold medal waiting for those who suffer more or less. But I do think it's to be present for people who do suffer, because I think that depression and loneliness that can creep in and become quite destructive is the thing that we want to, as people who want to love and support each other as God's called us to do, is to have. And personally, this is where I find myself in 2024. And if I have to hold true to that very psalm that I've shared with you, I do not know what lies ahead in 2024 tomorrow. But I've got to believe that thing that I ended with, that God is good, He's loving, He's gracious, and He's always in control. And that's the faith that we hold on to.
Much. Maybe I'll just ask one final question, and it links to the interfaith aspects. I think in South Africa, we are moving, over time, we're moving towards more secularism, and that is partly in respect of different faiths, and not trying to impose one faith on everybody, which is understandable, but often then we lose that faith perspective altogether. And I know, Christelle, because you work at St. Joseph's, which is founded and supported by the Palatine Sisters, so there's this strong Catholic foundation. How do you accommodate for different faiths? And you also mentioned that it's a place where you can freely express your faith. And maybe if you could just talk a little bit to that experience, and maybe what we should do more in other settings, because I know in working in some clinics, if often the sisters will start the day with a prayer and a song, and that works if everybody subscribes to the same faith. But it's often challenging when there's different faiths, and often then we just don't talk about faith at all because that's easier. So I just wondered if you could maybe make a few statements, comment.
Thank you. So I think that it is a gift to be able to pray at work, and we do have a prayer team, and we do start the day with prayer. And spiritual care is part of one of our strategic goals. And so one of the things that people assume sometimes is that you're making little Christians of children when they come into St. Joseph's. But I think the thing around holding on to spiritual care is something that I hold in my head and heart, is that tolerance is not equal to compromise, and that is for each person. So when a child comes into the service, what they come with as their family and their culture is the thing that you want to honor. So when we have a Muslim child who comes, our kitchen is halal. And so that is also part of the expectation of the health service. But if an imam wants to come and pray with the child, there will be an allowance and acceptance for that. And so it's to embrace all that the child requires in order to be restored. And I think similarly to what Prof said earlier around the fact that that healer in that different country may possibly not have that healing, but it's to let the journey play out for that family. At St. Joseph's, we also, we call it a reflective space. So if someone wants to share a thought for the day, or they're welcome to, it tends to end up being the Christians in the facility. But in our management meeting, it's a shared platform. And we are an integrated group there, and everyone has a turn. And so I think it is, again, about allowing an opportunity for people to feel that we are tolerating and not compromising, because I think the societies we're living in sometimes is not tolerant of each other's faith. Thank you.
Including, and then Tony, and then we'll wrap up.
When I listen to the pastoral care that at Red Cross, I also want to invite you to take an annual report that's outside. and read a little bit more about St. Joseph's. St. Joseph's is really an incredible place. It's in an oasis in the middle of the Cape Flats. And so if you have an opportunity, come visit us and come and see how you can possibly make a difference in the lives of children as well. Thank you.
Go for it, Tony.
I don't have anything profound to say, just to wish you all well on your discipleship journeys and the way you look after people. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause to our speakers? Yeah, just a huge thank you to Christelle and Tony for all that you shared and for really inspiring a wonderful discussion. Please feel free to chat a little bit more on your way out, and please do help yourself to some of the materials that Christelle has brought around St. Joseph's. There are actually a few of us connected to St. Joseph's, myself, Adrian, Christelle, Tony, Gloria. Everyone has some connections to St. Joseph's. So if you'd like to know more, please feel free to chat to us. And please, there's a website and there's materials, and please, you're most welcome to get involved in whatever way you'd like to. So this session today, it has been quite a heavy session. I almost feel like we all need to go for some group debriefing or something. But in all seriousness, if you do feel triggered by some of the things that have been said, and please reach out. Father Chiedza is our pastoral leader. He's our parish priest, and he's available. And otherwise, we can also connect you to resources if you'd like to be referred appropriately. So please reach out and don't sit with it alone if you are feeling triggered by some of the things that were said today. I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you for your time and attendance. It's a weekday evening and we appreciate your attendance and time. And we also just want to say a very big thank you to everyone who's worked behind the scenes, the Faith Formation team, Rob, who's helped us with our audiovisual, Lazarus, who's helped set up the venue, Jill and her team, who've helped with the catering, and everyone else who's involved. I apologize if I've missed any names, and Neil, who coordinates the Faith Pillar for the Parish Pastoral Council. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening, and please feel free to help yourself on your way out to some beverages.